It was the winter of 1945, deep in the frost-bitten remnants of a collapsing Nazi Germany. In the bomb-scarred outskirts of Hamburg, where shattered bricks still smoked and church bells lay buried under rubble, a silence had crept over the land. An eerie, exhausted silence that arrived only after years of deafening war. Snow drifted in thin, lonely sheets across the ruined streets, settling on burnt rooftops, broken carts, and the blackened skeletons of factories that once pumped life into a nation now brought to its knees. In the distance, the rumble of British military trucks echoed through the frozen morning. Measured, heavy, and inevitable. Inside a makeshift POW registration camp built within the ruins of an abandoned warehouse, a German mother named Elise Hartmann stood trembling beside her 3 children. Her clothes were threadbare, her hands cracked by cold, and her eyes swollen from weeks of fear and uncertainty. She was not a soldier, just one of the countless civilians swept into the chaos of captivity, accused of aiding German forces by supplying food to her conscripted husband. Her children pressed tightly against her coat, their breaths sharp and misty in the frigid air. The British soldiers who entered moved with a disciplined, emotionless calm, boots crunching against broken glass, uniforms damp with melted snow. Orders were shouted, papers checked, families separated. Then came the moment that would break Elise's heart in a way no bomb ever could. The soldiers forcefully took her 3 children from her arms. Her cries echoed across the cold concrete, swallowed by the great, indifferent roar of war's end. As Elise collapsed to her knees, helpless, the trucks rolled away with her children, disappearing into the blizzard like fading memories. The moment her children were taken from her did not erupt in chaos at first. It unfolded with a chilling, procedural calm that made it all the more terrifying, as if the world itself had turned cold and mechanical. Elise Hartmann stood in the center of the POW processing yard, the frigid wind slicing across her cheeks as she tried to keep her trembling children close. The British sergeant assigned to registration, a tall, broad man with a frost-stiffened mustache and eyes that had seen too much war, reviewed her papers with the slow, deliberate movements of someone accustomed to making life-altering decisions before breakfast. His gloved fingers turned each page as carefully as if he were peeling back memories, not documents. The air was so cold that every soldier's breath drifted outward in steady, ghost-like clouds, merging with the lingering smoke from a warehouse fire that had burned out days earlier. The atmosphere felt suspended between life and death, between the promise of liberation and the reality of harsh military rules. Elise watched his eyes narrow as he reached the handwritten accusation, scribbled in a hurried, almost spiteful script, claiming she had provided meals to her husband while he served on the front lines. She tried to explain in shaky, broken English that a wife bringing bread to her starving husband did not make her a collaborator, but her voice quivered beneath the weight of exhaustion, grief, and the language barrier. The sergeant didn't shout, didn't curse, didn't raise his weapon. He simply followed orders, and those orders meant that any suspected supporter of the German military, no matter how small the act, was to be detained separately while their children were sent to temporary shelters for medical inspection and assessment. It was policy, cold, brutal policy, and policy did not bend for trembling mothers. Behind Elise, the camp buzzed with movement. Boots thudded across cracked concrete. Metal crates clanged as they were dragged across the snow. A distant whistle blew as another transport truck signaled its departure. Soldiers moved like shadows, disciplined, focused, efficient, while displaced civilians huddled together in small clusters, waiting for their names to be called, their fates to be decided by strangers who did not know their stories. The air smelled of damp wool, burning diesel, and the metallic sting of blood from frost-bitten fingers and cold, cracked lips. Elise felt her youngest daughter, little Marta, clutching her coat so tightly that her knuckles whitened. The child was shaking not from the cold, but from a fear she was too young to articulate. Her son stood stiffly beside her, trying to appear brave, though their wide, frightened eyes betrayed them. When two British soldiers approached with quiet, almost apologetic footsteps, Elise's stomach twisted. She knew something was wrong before they spoke a single word. One of them, a younger soldier with a soft face and barely any stubble, calmly informed her that her children were to be transported for safety and medical checkups, standard procedure for minors of suspected collaborators. He said it as if it were a simple thing, as if telling a mother she would be separated from her children was no more serious than informing her of a weather change. Elise's panic erupted instantly. She shook her head violently, clutching her children, as if her arms alone could anchor them to her side. Her voice rose into a desperate cry, pleading in German for them not to take her babies. The soldiers hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, but they remained bound to duty. When Elise stepped back, the sergeant nodded, and the two younger soldiers gently but firmly moved in. One reached for her daughter first. Marta screamed, a sharp, heart-piercing sound that cut through the winter air like a blade. Elise reacted instinctively, lunging forward, but the second soldier intercepted her, gripping her arms in a hold that was secure but not violent. Still, to Elise, it felt like an iron cage. She twisted, struggled, begged, cried. But the soldier held her steady, repeating, "It's temporary, for their safety," though the words meant nothing to her. The children were lifted into the back of a truck, lined with rough wooden slats and thin blankets that did little to shield against the cold. Her sons climbed in without resisting, tears streaming silently down their faces as they tried to be brave for their mother. But Marta reached out with both hands, screaming her mother's name, and that sound, the raw desperation of a child torn away, echoed harshly off the concrete walls of the abandoned warehouse that had become their prison. Elise's legs nearly buckled as she felt the separation happening in real time, as if her heart were being peeled away layer by layer. Her mind raced in dizzying spirals, imagining horrors she could not prevent: illness, hunger, mistreatment, a clerical error that might send her children far away to an orphanage or to another camp entirely. She could not control her breathing. Each inhale was sharp, painful, frost-bitten. The soldier holding her murmured something she could not understand, but she heard sympathy in the tone, which somehow made it worse. She did not want sympathy. She wanted her children. The truck's engine rumbled to life, its vibrations crawling across the frozen ground. Elise cried out again, a wild, primal sound that came from a place deeper than fear, deeper even than despair, an instinctive howl of motherhood. She tore forward with such force that the soldier restraining her almost lost his grip, but he held firm, his eyes flickering with visible discomfort as tears streamed down her cheeks. A second soldier climbed into the back of the truck to sit with the children, wrapping a blanket around them. His compassion, though genuine, did nothing to soothe the agony tearing through Elise. Snowflakes drifted slowly from the sky, melting instantly on the warm engine hood. They landed on Elise's hair, her coat, her lashes, blurring her vision as she watched the truck edge forward inch by inch. Every turn of the tires felt like a countdown, each rotation pulling her children farther into uncertainty. Marta continued to cry until the truck rounded the corner of a half-collapsed building and her voice vanished, not because she stopped screaming, but because distance swallowed her. The moment she could no longer hear her daughter, Elise sagged forward, her body trembling, her breath breaking into shuddering fragments. The soldier released her arms but stayed close, wary she might fall. She did fall, onto her knees in the slush, hands sinking into the icy mud. Her fingers stung, but she barely noticed. All she could feel was the emptiness where her children had been. Around her, camp life continued. A whistle blew again. A registration clerk shouted for the next family to step forward. A British medic hurried past carrying bandages. But for Elise, the world had stopped. She stared down the road the truck had taken, as if sheer willpower could bring it back. Tears dripped silently from her chin into the dirty snow. She could still see the imprint of her daughter's small hand on her sleeve. She could still hear the echoes of that final cry ricocheting through her skull. She could not think. She could not breathe. She could not imagine surviving even a single hour without her children, let alone the unknown days ahead. In that moment, Elise understood what true helplessness meant. Not the fear of bombs overhead, or the dread of starvation, or the uncertainty of displacement. Those were terrors she had endured for years. But this was different. This was the ripping away of her very reason to hold on. The war had taken her husband to the front lines. It had taken her home, her safety, her pride, her future. But now it had taken her children, and she had nothing left to fight with but hope. Fragile and trembling like her breath in the frozen air. The last thing she saw before lowering her head into her hands was the fading blur of tire tracks in the snow. Proof that her children had been there moments ago. Proof that they were now gone. Her heart felt as cold as the winter wind. And in the emptiness of that POW courtyard, surrounded by strangers and soldiers and the indifferent mechanics of war, she realized she had never felt more alone. The next 48 hours unfolded for Elise in a blur so heavy and disorienting that it felt less like time passing and more like drowning slowly in a sea of fear. The moment the truck carrying her children disappeared beyond the ruined walls of the camp, her world narrowed into a tunnel of cold, hunger, and unrelenting anxiety. She was processed immediately after the separation, her hands shaking uncontrollably as she was guided toward the makeshift intake station. The warehouse turned processing center was dimly lit by weak bulbs, strung haphazardly along rafters that sagged from years of neglect and recent shell fire. Rainwater dripped slowly from a shattered skylight, each drop echoing through the cavernous interior with a hollow metallic note, adding to the heavy, suffocating atmosphere. The British clerks behind the wooden tables looked exhausted, their uniforms wrinkled and their eyes heavy from weeks of handling endless crowds of displaced civilians. Elise stood before them as her information was recorded. A flashbulb from a military camera burst to life, briefly illuminating the room in harsh, unforgiving light as her intake photograph was taken. She blinked rapidly, the white spot dancing in her vision long after the camera had been removed. Her photograph, like hundreds pinned to the corkboard behind the clerk, captured not a criminal, but a mother stripped of everything but terror. Once processed, Elise was escorted into a holding barrack on the eastern edge of the camp. It had once been a storage shed for tools and machinery, but now it held rows of metal cots covered with thin, grey blankets that smelled faintly of smoke and disinfectant. The air inside was still and heavy, filled with the quiet murmur of women who, like Elise, had been separated from their families. Their faces were hollow, eyes sunken and distant, each carrying a story of loss etched deeply into their expressions. Some whispered to themselves, reliving moments they wished they could undo. Others stared blankly at the walls, their tears long since dried, their grief turned into numb acceptance. Elise was guided to an empty cot near the back. The mattress was stiff, cold, and unyielding beneath her as she sat down slowly, her hands clasped together so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She looked around, searching for any sign of comfort, but found none. The only warmth in the room came from the flickering lantern position near the door, casting long shadows across the women who gathered around it, trying to absorb even the illusion of heat. The night that followed was one of the longest of Elise's life. She could not sleep, not even for a moment. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard her daughter's scream echoing through her mind, felt the tightening grip of the soldier's hands on her arms, saw the truck rolling away. She imagined her children shivering beneath thin blankets, their stomachs empty, their small bodies curled together for warmth. Her fear twisted itself into grotesque shapes inside her mind. What if they were taken to another camp? One far away. What if the paperwork was lost? What if they grew sick? What if she never saw them again? The what-ifs pressed against her chest like stones, making each breath slow and painful. She curled forward on the cot, arms wrapped tightly around her ribs, as if holding herself closed would somehow prevent her heart from breaking entirely. The barrack door creaked open several times throughout the night as guards performed their rounds. Each time the lantern light flared briefly, Elise's head snapped up with frantic hope, only for it to extinguish when no news came. The men who entered spoke in hushed voices, their boots scraping along the wooden floor. They avoided meeting the eyes of the women. They knew what separation looked like, and they wanted no part in adding to the pain. The hours dragged on, one indistinguishable from the next. Outside the thin walls, the wind howled through gaps in the metal siding, creating a low, mournful whistle that at times sounded hauntingly like a crying child. Elise clutched her knees to her chest whenever she heard it. Morning arrived with no gentleness. Weak sunlight seeped through a small, cracked window, illuminating dust floating in the air like drifting snowflakes. A guard entered and called out names from a clipboard, assigning work details or directing prisoners to further interrogation. Elise's name was not called. She both feared and longed for the moment it would be, torn between wanting answers about her children and fearing any news that might confirm her worst nightmares. She looked around and realized many of the women who had filled the barrack the night before were gone. Transferred, questioned, relocated. The ones who remained had the same hollow-eyed look she felt spreading through her own expression. At midday, thin bowls of watery soup were distributed. Elise lifted the bowl reluctantly, her hands trembling so badly that the liquid sloshed against the edges. She forced herself to drink. Hunger made her weak. Weakness made her useless, and she needed strength to find her children. When she finished, she set the empty bowl aside and pressed her palms together beneath her chin, whispering a prayer she barely remembered from her childhood. Something about protection, something about mercy. The words felt fragile and uncertain on her tongue, but she repeated them anyway, clinging to anything that resembled hope. Meanwhile, somewhere beyond the walls of her barrack, forces Elise could not see were shifting. At a nearby administrative post, British officers had begun reviewing the backlog of civilian cases, attempting to correct errors and reclassify those detained without proper evidence. Stacks of paperwork filled wooden desks, documents organized in neat piles and overflowing crates. Among those papers was Elise's file, a young intelligence officer, his hair still too fair and his cheeks too smooth for the horrors he had witnessed. Reviewed the accusations with a furrowed brow. He had seen thousands of cases in the past weeks, many filled with genuine allegations of collaboration or violence. But Elise's file felt different. The accusation against her was vague, unsupported, and written by a neighbor known to have long-standing grudges against several families. The officer rubbed his forehead, fatigue pressing against his temples. He reached for a second folder, her husband's military record, recently obtained. It revealed details no one in the camp had known. The man had been forcibly conscripted, had no record of misconduct, and had spent most of the war stationed hundreds of miles from any active combat zone. The more the officer referenced the documents, the more the inconsistencies became undeniable. By late afternoon, a British captain with a weathered face and an expression that conveyed both authority and humanity stepped into the office to check on the day's progress. The intelligence officer presented Elise's file to him, outlining the issues, the lack of evidence, the likelihood of wrongful detainment. The captain listened in silence, his jaw tightening slightly as he read through the papers. After several moments, he sighed, a deep, heavy exhale that came from someone who understood the consequences of bureaucracy, tangled with war. With a short nod, he signed an order for immediate evaluation and family reunification. His voice was calm but firm when he spoke. If we've made a mistake, we correct it, immediately. That decision, made in a cramped room full of crumpled papers and ringing telephones, was the pivot upon which Elise's fate began to turn, though she had no way of knowing it. Back in the barrack, the day melted slowly into evening. Shadows stretched across the floor as the sun dipped behind clouds swollen with more snow. The lantern flickered again, casting jittery patterns onto the wooden beams above. Elise sat rigidly on her cot, exhausted but unable to rest. Every sound outside made her heart stutter. Footsteps. Shuffling, a distant engine. Each one made her lift her head in desperate anticipation. Each one left her disappointed. It wasn't until darkness thickened and candles were distributed to replace the failing lantern that the barrack door swung open with a sudden, sharp creak. A soldier stepped inside, calling out a name, not hers. Another half hour passed, more footsteps. Another name, still not hers. She gripped the edge of the cot until her fingers ached. Then, suddenly, the door opened again, and this time the soldier's voice cut through the heavy air with unmistakable clarity as he called, Elise Hartman. Her breath stopped. For a moment, she felt too weak to stand. Her legs trembled beneath her as she pushed herself upright. She stepped into the icy night air, her breath forming clouds before her face. The soldier didn't give details. He offered no explanation. He simply motioned for her to follow. Her heart hammered in her chest. Was she being moved to a different camp? Was she being punished? Was she being interrogated again? Every possibility terrified her. They walked across the snowy yard, passing guards whose faces were blurred by darkness and drifting flakes. The wind stung her cheeks, but she barely felt it. Her entire focus narrowed to the soldiers' boots crunching in front of her. They approached a clearing near the medical tents, illuminated by a single floodlight that buzzed faintly against the cold metal pole supporting it. The soldier stopped, turning to her with an expression she couldn't decipher. Before she could ask anything, she heard it. A faint, quivering sound carried through the cold air like a beam of light piercing through fog. "Mother?" Her son's voice. Unmistakable, fragile, real. Her knees nearly collapsed beneath her as her heart surged with a violent mixture of disbelief, shock, and hope that threatened to tear her apart. She looked toward the sound, her breath catching in her throat as she saw 3 small figures standing near the canvas wall of the medical tent. Her children. Elise did not move at first. She couldn't. Her mind, exhausted and bruised by fear, refused to believe what her eyes were showing her. Her children, her 3 beautiful, trembling living children, stood there in the cold, illuminated by a pale cone of light from the medical tent. The sight struck her like a physical blow. For 48 agonizing hours she had imagined them sick, freezing, alone, or lost in some distant corner of the broken world the war had left behind. Yet here they were, wrapped in British-issued blankets that hung to their ankles, their faces flushed pink from the tent's warmth, their eyes wide and fixed on her with the same stunned disbelief. Her oldest son, Lucas, stood slightly ahead of the others, his jaw tight, his shoulders squared, as if he had taken responsibility for protecting his siblings in her absence. Her middle son, Emil, held Marta's hand so tightly that their fingers appeared fused. And little Marta, precious, fragile Marta, had her face half hidden behind her brothers, peeking out with eyes that shimmered with tears and confusion. The moment Elise's legs remembered how to move, she stumbled forward with such speed that she almost fell. Her breath burst from her in sharp, uneven gasps, and she covered the distance between them in a matter of seconds. Her children ran to her at the same time, their cries rising into the cold night like the voices of ghosts being returned to life. She fell to her knees in the snow as the 3 of them collided with her, their small arms wrapping around her neck, her shoulders, her waist, any part of her they could cling to. She pulled them all close, her hands trembling as she touched their hair, their cheeks, their backs, needing to confirm that they were warm, real, solid. She pressed her face into Marta's hair, inhaling the faint scent of antiseptic that clung to her, mixed with the familiar smell of her daughter's skin. It overwhelmed her. Tears poured freely down her cheeks, dripping onto the tops of their heads, mingling with the melting snow. For several seconds no one spoke. They didn't need to. Their bodies communicated everything. Fear, relief, disbelief, love, desperation, and the profound ache of a separation that never should have happened. The air hummed around them, the floodlight buzzing like a low electrical heartbeat as shadows shifted gently over the frozen ground. The soldier who had brought Elise there stepped back respectfully, giving the small family the fragile privacy carved out by the circle of light. Other soldiers nearby paused their tasks, watching silently. Some tightened their jaws, others lowered their heads. A few exchanged glances that carried the weight of men who had seen far too many broken families and understood the significance of witnessing one being restored. After a long, trembling moment, Elise leaned back just enough to look into her children's faces. "My loves, my angels, are you hurt?" she whispered, her voice breaking on each word. Lucas shook his head quickly, wiping his eyes with the sleeve of his blanket. "We're not hurt, "Mama," he said, though the quiver in his voice revealed the terror he had endured. Emil nodded in agreement, but his lip trembled as he spoke. "They took us to a doctor. They checked us. We stayed in a warm room. But we didn't know if you—" He couldn't finish. The fear of losing her had coiled too tightly inside him. Elise cupped his face gently, smoothing his tears with her thumb. "I am here," she whispered. "I am here, and I will never leave you again." Little Marta clung to her mother's coat, her small fists gripping the fabric as if afraid Elise might disappear again. "Mama," I cried. She sobbed softly, her voice thin and breathy. "I cried all night. I thought you wouldn't find me." Elise pulled her close, pressing her daughter's trembling body against her chest. "I would search every corner of the world for you," she whispered into Marta's hair. "There is no place you could be that I would not go." The warmth of the reunion wrapped around them like a blanket, but beneath it lay the raw, jagged remnants of a trauma that had carved itself into their hearts. The pain did not vanish, it simply softened under the glow of relief. When Elise finally stood up, still holding Marta in her arms, she turned to the soldier who had led her there. He stepped forward with a solemn expression. "Mrs. Hartman," he said gently, "you and your children are to be released from detainment. It seems there was a mistake in your file." He paused as if bracing himself for her reaction. "You will be placed in the civilian resettlement area while your case is reviewed, but you will stay together." Elise stared at him, her breath catching in her throat. Words tangled in her mind, too many and none at all. She managed only a hoarse whisper, "Thank you." The soldier nodded, his eyes softening. "It's the least we can do." He gestured toward a nearby tent, where a British nurse waited. She was young, her face pale and tired but kind. She stepped toward the family with slow, careful movements. "Let me check the children one more time," she said softly, as though afraid to disturb the fragile peace of the moment. Elise hesitated but allowed it, keeping one hand on each of her children as they were guided into the tent. The interior was warm, lit by lanterns hung on makeshift hooks. The air smelled of iodine, wood smoke, and damp canvas. Medical supplies were arranged on tables fashioned from wooden crates. Other children rested on narrow cots, some sleeping, others sipping hot broth. Nurses moved quietly between them, their footsteps muffled on the ground cloth. Inside the tent, the nurse examined each of Elise's children with a gentle but practiced hand. She checked their pulses, looked at their throats, felt their foreheads for fever. When she finished, she offered them each a small cup of warm tea. "They're healthy," she said softly to Elise. "Cold, scared, but healthy." Elise nodded, relief washing through her so powerfully that her knees nearly gave out again. She took a slow breath, willing herself to remain steady. The nurse studied her face for a moment. "You've all been through something terrible," she murmured. "But you're together now. That matters." As the children sipped their tea, Lucas lifted his gaze to his mother with a question in his weary eyes. "Mama," he whispered, "will they take us again?" The words twisted sharply in Elise's chest. She crouched beside him, taking his hand between both of hers. "No," she said firmly, though fear nipped at the edges of her promise. "I will not let that happen again. You are my heart. And I will never let anyone take my heart away from me." Lucas swallowed hard and nodded, though his eyes glimmered with lingering doubt. The nurse returned with warm, slightly oversized coats. British issue, rough in texture, but thick enough to fight the cold. She helped the children slip into them. Elise watched as her children's shoulders visibly relaxed once warmth enveloped them. She realized, with a shudder, how deeply the cold had seeped into their bones. After everything they had endured, something as simple as warmth felt like a miracle. Once the examination was done, the nurse led them outside. The night sky above had cleared, revealing a scattering of stars that glittered faintly through thin clouds. The camp around them buzzed with distant movement, but here, near the medical tents, there was a hush, as though the world itself understood the fragility of this moment. A British officer approached Elise with several documents in hand. He spoke calmly, his tone steady and non-threatening. "Mrs. Hartman, you have been reclassified. You will be transferred to a civilian safe zone tomorrow morning. Until then, you and your children will stay in a heated shelter set aside for families." Elise nodded, though her mind only half processed the words. All she could truly focus on was the weight of Marta resting against her hip, the warmth of Emil's hand gripping her sleeve, the quiet determination in Lucas's gaze as he walked beside her. These were the anchors pulling her back into the world after days adrift in fear. As they were escorted toward their temporary shelter, the camp lights flickered softly behind them. Elise glanced over her shoulder once. She saw the long shadows cast by the tents, the moving silhouettes of soldiers, the dark outlines of trucks idling in the distance. Just 48 hours earlier, this place had taken everything from her. Now, through some unlikely convergence of paperwork, corrections, human decency, and sheer luck, it had given her everything back. The war had already carved deep wounds into her family, wounds that would take years to heal. But tonight, she walked forward holding the hands of her children, their footsteps crunching in the snow, their breaths rising in tiny clouds that drifted upward into the cold, clear sky. She reached the small shelter assigned to them, a simple wooden hut, crude but warm. When the door closed behind them, sealing out the wind, Elise felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: safety. Fragile, uncertain, temporary, but real. She knelt on the wooden floor, pulling her children close again. This time, her embrace was not fueled by panic or desperation. It was gratitude, relief, awe at the miracle she had nearly lost. The children curled around her, exhausted but finally calm. Lucas rested his head against her shoulder. Emil pressed his cheek against her arm. Marta fell asleep with her small hand clutching her mother's collar. Elise looked at their sleeping faces and understood something with painful clarity. War had the power to take everything in an instant, but sometimes, rarely, unpredictably, impossibly, it also returned something precious. She exhaled a long, trembling breath and laid her cheek against her daughter's hair. And for the first time in days, her tears were warm.